Hello, U.S. history students. This is Mr. Freeze.
And Mrs. Freeze here to talk to you for our second lesson of our progressive era. This is all about captains of industry.
So today we're going to bring you the story of two men who will end up being the two of the richest people in the history of not just the United States, but the world, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. And if you notice the title up here, Captains of Industry, this is a positive name that's going to be given to these men. However, by the end of this class, we're also going to look at the other side of their story, which some people view them in a negative light, that they were actually the criminal rich and abused their workers, took advantage of them, paid them low wages. But it can't be denied either way, these two men changed the landscape of America. So what you need to know, the big thing that you need to take away from this to give this context in the 1900s is that in the early 1900s, the government had a hands-off approach to the economy. And what we mean by that is there were very little rules, regulations. You could have children work in factories. You could pay your workers very little. There was no minimum wage.
You could have them working extremely long hours in relatively dangerous conditions.
And this is because they believed in a system of what is known as pure capitalism. So what capitalism is, it is an economic system in which supply and demand determine prices. So we have a large amount of a capitalist economy in the United States. And the goal of capitalism is if you as a private citizen want to create your own business, you can do that. And what's the goal of capitalism? If you set up a lemonade stand, what is your goal?
I know.
Go ahead.
It would be to make money, and I would want to make as much money as possible.
Okay, and that's kind of the idea there of capitalism. The reason you start up a business is to make profit.
And we'll go a little further into this in another lesson. If you're not familiar with terms like supply and demand and stuff like that, all this really means is that when you have a business one day, the government is not going to tell you how much to charge for your product. You're going to figure that out based on what the market will allow. If you try to charge too much, no one's going to buy it, and you're going to have a product just sitting around collecting dust. If you charge too little, everyone's going to buy it, and you're going to run out of your product.
So at this point in time, the government believes in being laissez-faire. And I know this is corny, but in my classroom, what I have my students do is put their hands on their desks. And every time I say laissez-faire, they take their hands off the desk and put them up as if they've committed a crime, and they're putting their hands up, because laissez-faire means the government should keep its hands off of businesses.
And he's actually doing this right now. And it is corny, but a good way to remember.
And it works. All my students who have been in my class, still to the point where they are graduating high school and in college, still remember what laissez-faire means, because it means that government is not going to make any rules. They are going to stay out of business. This French word laissez-faire literally means to let be. And they are going to let businesses be to do their own thing, to set their own rules, their own hours, their own wages, and so on and so forth.
And if you were a business leader in the early 1900s, like a Rockefeller or a Carnegie, you would love that policy, because it would allow you to maximize your profit by cutting expenses in other places.
So to kind of prove how laissez-faire, and hopefully all of you just stuck your hands up in the air right there, because
Mr.
it means
Freeze
hands
is
off.
his hands
I
up.
am. Can you name one U.S. president from 1868 to 1901?
They probably can't.
It's extremely
those of you
difficult.
that think you are history buffs probably can't do it.
Because during this time, presidents and Congress, for that matter, are very, very hands-off. They make very little rules or regulations about anything doing with business. And because of that, the presidents are just pretty much in there.
They basically just hung out. It was just like a fun time.
Well, unless you were in the South during Reconstruction and slavery.
I'm talking about for the presidents.
For the presidents, yes,
Yeah.
Absolutely. But these presidents right here did very little in terms of passing legislation and enforcing legislation. Legislation is a big word for laws that limited the power of businessmen. So during the 1900s, Americans, and these are going to be very few in number, but they are going to make a vast fortune through industry. And if you remember our last lesson about industrialization, they are going to be making things that are going to fuel the industrial revolution of the United States.
And just to make sure you're understanding what Mr. Free says when he says a few, the people at the top who owned these new factories and businesses, they were making fortunes. The people actually in the factories working for them were not making fortunes. They were barely making anything.
So those few people at the top, though, did take a risk. They were what we call entrepreneurs. They were
Another
people,
fancy word in red. Make sure you know it.
They were people who took a risk and started a company. So modern day entrepreneurs are people like Steve Jobs from Apple, Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, even my brother who started his own landscaping company, or my mother started her own company as well. They are entrepreneurs. They took a risk. They started a company.
And again, why it's a risk is anytime you do something new, you don't know how it's going to go. So you could invest all your savings, all your time into some idea that you think is great. It might end up great and you might make a fortune, or it might flop and you'll have lost all of that. But think of if you've ever seen the show on ABC, Shark Tank, where people come on with all these ideas and they try to sell their ideas to people like Mark Cuban and whoever the other business people are on that show. And they're the sharks, and they want these people to invest money in their idea. Those are entrepreneurs.
So the two entrepreneurs we're going to talk about today are Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. And we're going to dive pretty deeply into both these guys in a second. But as Mrs. Freeze just mentioned a second ago, if their name is in red, that's a name you definitely need to know here. These two gentlemen not only would be entrepreneurs, but they would form what are known as monopolies. Mono, that prefix there, means one. And a monopoly is when one business has complete control of a product or service. These people like Rockefeller and Carnegie.
And they had a lot of other rich friends that monopolized other industries. We're specifically focusing on them, but there were other men just like them in the shipping industry, in the railroad industry, in everywhere you looked.
So mono means one, like a monarch means one ruler, one
like
king or queen. Monopoly, one business has control.
Monogamous. You're in a relationship with just one person, not dating a lot of people.
Let's hope not.
Monotheistic, religion that worships just one God as opposed to many. Monotone, someone who talks in a really monotone, boring voice.
Yeah, can't imagine what that's like. But moving on, if you've ever played the game Monopoly.
Great game, takes hours though.
Yeah, but if you have ever played the game to completion, you want to explain how the game is won?
Yes, because I was quite the aficionado in this back in my day. So Monopoly, if you're ever playing, you want to own the most properties, because then every time someone lands on your property, they have to pay you money. You want to monopolize the board. So everywhere they go, they pay you until you have all the money and they have nothing.
Right. So you want to buy up the railroads. You want to buy up the boardwalk. You want to buy up
especially
Park
those
Place.
Are the expensive ones.
Right.
And
but
Park
once
Place.
You get all the money, you can monopolize the board or take everything until you're the only one left. And that's the whole idea. Now, there are modern day monopolies as well right now that are beginning to form. Companies like Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook. I don't know if you've heard, but we're in the middle of a global pandemic where millions of people are out of work right now. Shops are starting to close out. But these businesses right here
are taking over the world.
They are. If you look at the stock market right now, these are all-time highs. And one of the reasons why is because when these little mom and pop stores are going out of business, even in our own area, companies like this are benefiting or buying them out. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but Facebook and Instagram are actually the same company. And why is that? Because Facebook
swallows up everything in its path.
Okay, they bought out Instagram. They did. Yeah.
And here's the thing to also note: historically, Americans do not really like the idea of monopolies. We like to think that lots of businesses should be able to compete and thrive and do well. But when a business monopolizes an industry, that can lead to some bad things. For example, like there's only one company that you can get something from, that company can jack up their prices and there's nowhere else you can go. So you need to just keep paying their prices. And again, like Mr. Freeze mentioned, a lot of these big businesses kill off smaller businesses.
So the first monopolist that we're going to talk about was Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Carnegie, the big thing you need to know about him is that he was the steel king. Carnegie and steel are synonymous with each other. They go hand in hand.
So this guy, he's a true, what we call like a rags to riches story. His family was dirt poor living in Scotland. They moved here when he was a young kid. And here's the thing, he grew up poor and knew he didn't want to live that way forever. So he's going to come here and take little jobs and work his way up. And he was a hard worker.
Taught himself to read.
He had, and we're going to talk more about these guys in a later lesson, but he taught himself. He was self-educated. And if you look, he produced the majority of our steel. He's producing more steel in his company than all of England produced altogether. And if you look, by the time he's in his early 30s, he's making $40 million a year, which is more than Mr. Freeze and I will ever earn if we combine everything we make for a lifetime. So
that's depressing, isn't it?
Yes, it is kind of depressing. But and here's the thing, he worked tirelessly to build this empire, but a lot of his empire is going to be built on the backs of his workers.
And if you haven't guessed it, Carnegie ran his business out of Pittsburgh. In fact, Pittsburgh is known for steel even today. In fact, the emblem for the Pittsburgh Steelers helmet, this actually, my wife is not a big fan of the Steelers. I still am.
Actually, I'm not a fan of any football.
The emblem here is actually U.S. Steel. And the Steelers come from the fact that we were, and I shouldn't say we, the city I'm from, Pittsburgh, was the center of the steelmaking industry in the United States. So steel allowed for large skyscrapers to be built. In fact, skyscrapers in New York, such as the Empire State Building, could not have been built without steel. Buildings used to be built before steel was created with iron. The problem with iron is if you've ever left iron outside or if it's been exposed to water, it gets brittle. It can break, it can rust, and it's not really strong. But due to a process known as the Bessemer process, which in chemistry you might learn about it, basically it made a really strong metal that could produce things like skyscrapers, which when we talk about in our urbanization unit, our lesson, you'll see it playing a role there. The Washington Monument has steel in it. The Brooklyn Bridge was made with steel from Pittsburgh. And Carnegie, his steel is going into everything at this point. And you may be asking, well, yeah, that's great. He's making a lot of steel. How did he form a monopoly? And it's not brain surgery. In fact, he made it pretty simple. He could tell you how to make monopoly in one sentence here. Cut the prices, meaning drop your prices so low.
So you put everyone else out of business because no one can compete with you.
And then once you drive them out of business, scoop the market, meaning buy those businesses out, take their companies over, run the mills full, meaning, hey, have your workers work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In Pittsburgh, he ran his mills so constantly that if you wore a white shirt out at the beginning of the day, by the time you came home, that shirt would be dark gray because of all the pollution from the mills. Pittsburgh was one of the most polluted cities in the world at the start of the 1900s. He says, watch the cost. You don't want to pay your workers too much or make repairs because that costs money. And if you do all that, profits will take care of themselves and you'll end up being one of the richest people in the United States. So what he did is he bought up all the coal fields, or coke fields they're called, the iron ore, the steel mills, the ships, the railroads. He controlled all the aspects of production needed to make steel. And because of that, he is going to corner the market, have a monopoly, and make millions and millions and millions of dollars, which in today's money translates to billions and billions and billions.
Now, if you look, here's another fancy word in red, philanthropist. All right, so a lot of times, even in today's day and age, people with large amounts of money like to do something good with that money. And Carnegie and Rockefeller were no different. So what these guys did was they donated large sums of money to charitable types of organizations that they thought could better their community. So Andrew Carnegie in particular would always talk about how no person should die rich. Before you die, you should take all of that money and put it to good use. And so again, we'll kind of look at this toward the later part of this lesson. So these guys didn't pay their workers well. They really were tough bosses and benefited from their workers' labor. But then they're, on the other hand, they are going to take tons of money and donate it to good causes. So again, if any of you have ever donated to anything, whether it is some type of cancer research organization or an organization to help the homeless, you are philanthropists. Just most of us are on a smaller scale than these guys, because we don't all just have billions of dollars sitting around.
So look, these are kind of the two sides right here, because on one hand, Carnegie is saying, look, let's build libraries. He built thousands of libraries in Pittsburgh.
His workers never would have been at these libraries because they worked all the time. They would never have had a chance to go to a library.
But they're still there today in Pittsburgh. And Carnegie is just plastered. That name is plastered. Carnegie Mellon University, Carnegie libraries are all throughout Pittsburgh. There's an area of Pittsburgh known as Carnegie.
And libraries were pretty dear to him. That's how he educated himself. He didn't have a formal education.
At the same time, where he is being this philanthropist and donating money and establishing universities, and even if you're a musician, Carnegie Hall, where the Pittsburgh Symphony plays,
his workers could not have afforded to
go
to Carnegie Hall to see a concert. He is
doing all this really nice stuff, while at the same time to his workers, paying them very little wages. When they got injured on the job, they were just fired. Meanwhile, he is building this stuff in the background. So he really has two sides to him, to the point where when his workers will go on strike at one point, he will actually bring in an armed militia to take out the striking workers who refuse to leave the business. So Carnegie, either way, he really transformed the steel industry in the United States, and especially the city of Pittsburgh and every city in the United States that has steel in its buildings.
Now, the other guy who, again, and these are not the only two large industrialists of the time, but these are the two we're focusing on, John D. Rockefeller. Very similar to Andrew Carnegie, ruthless in his business practices. He's going to put a ton of small oil businesses, particularly in Pennsylvania and Ohio, out of business, but he creates this large monopoly called the Standard Oil Company. So you should always associate Rockefeller with oil, and in particular, the Standard Oil Company. And he was a big fan of making his business through what we call the merger movement. So you've probably heard the word merger before, another one of these terms in red, but it's when you take a bunch of smaller businesses, buy them all up, and put them into one large business. And he did this in a pretty vicious way. He would offer to buy a person's business. They might agree and sell it to him, but if they didn't, he would lower his prices so much, steal all their customers away, and then when they had no customers left, they would go out of business. He would buy up their business, and then he would just jack his prices back up. So again, he was ruthless, as a lot of these business people were.
And we still see this today. I don't know if you guys know this, but Amazon found a competitor in Whole Foods, and they said, look, why would we be competing against Whole Foods? Let's just buy them out. So if you go to Whole Foods, you're actually buying from Amazon. It may be called Whole Foods, but it's underneath the same company. And today we've been seeing many mergers take place again. So we've been seeing a little bit of history repeating here. So again, the way he did this was that any competing oil refineries, he just lowered the prices till he put them out of business, bought them up until they were all part of the Standard Oil Company. And the actual businesses would still stand. It's just that he would now own it, and all the profits would go to John D. Rockefeller. It's also known as a trust, or a group of separate companies that are placed under the control of one single owner. And so Rockefeller was the pioneer of the merger movement that led to trust. So later on, when you hear about trust busting presidents, this is what we're talking about. They're going to bust up or break up these companies that just had gotten too big. But Rockefeller also was a philanthropist. In fact, he donated a lot to the Institute for Medical Research, the University of Chicago, and in today's money, I can't
over
even
$530 million.
Right,
He's
but
donating.
that was
and
back
again,
then.
that was just like a small part of his money, but that's how much money he had that he could just give that away for these good causes. So again, these guys really gave us some wonderful things here.
So University of Chicago, as we mentioned. So look, let's talk about all the good things, and then I'll let my wife talk about all the rough things here. But I'm going to take
give me the bad stuff.
Yeah, you're going to be the bad guy today. Carnegie and Rockefellers were captains of industry. They transformed the United States of America. They increased the supply of good, which led to lower prices for consumers. They created hundreds and thousands of jobs. They donated money and were philanthropists, and they transformed the entire landscape of the United States, leading to bigger cities. And look, without them, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but World War I's coming up in about 17 years here. If we were not an industrialized country that had steel and oil and railroads and manufacturing set up like we do, we may not have been able to have the impact on World War I that we did. All right, now for the opposing side here.
So again, if you were to ask Rockefeller or Carnegie, sorry for my daughter there in the background, if you were to ask them and their wealthy friends, what are you guys? They would say, we're captains of industry. We've done great things. Now, here's the thing. Like most people, there's good and bad in all of us. But if you were to ask their workers or just the poor segments of society, they would say, you know what, they're not captains of industry, they're robber barons. And when you see the word robber, automatically there's a negative connotation to that. These people would say, these rich guys controlled the government. They used their money and influence to get laws passed that only benefited them. They hurt small businesses. They put tons of people out of business when they were buying people out, when they were lowering their prices so they could steal other people's customers. With all that money they had, they paid their workers very, very little. Bad working conditions. And again, if you got injured on the job, at this time, there wasn't any workers' compensation. You just got fired and they replaced you with someone else. And others would also point out that they polluted, as Mr. Freeze was talking about, the city of Pittsburgh and other cities, and they just drained us of our natural resources and mostly benefited themselves off of the labor of others. So again, like most people, we all have good and bad. And so these guys, it depends on who you ask, you'll get different answers. I would say they did a lot of good, but they also probably could have treated their workers better.
And the big thing to really hit on here again is that every time somebody tried to make a law to protect natural resources or to reduce pollution
or to protect workers,
to have better working conditions, to have better pay, they would pay off the government. They would give money to government officials to make sure those laws were not passed through. And you'll see that in a lot of political cartoons that we look at as well throughout the year.
Now, we will, in an upcoming lesson, really kind of teach you about how you analyze political cartoons, because you might be looking at this right now and not fully get it. But here's Standard Oil, which hopefully you see that and automatically think Rockefeller. Here's some oil rigs, and it's showing that this monsterish type thing, and here it is. It has its tentacles all over our parts of government, and it just looks like this big scary thing that is slowly taking over the world, or at least our country. Here's the White House. That's the next thing that it's going to be reaching for. So again, we'll have a whole lesson on this later about how you interpret things like this. But tons of cartoons at the time really illustrated the fear that people had of these businesses.
All right, we'll get to this in a later later lesson. Sorry about that, but we're good. We're good for today. This is what I put out for the trash one time. Trust me, it relates to what I'm going to be talking about. But thank you guys.
Later.
Yeah, hope you're
Thanks
doing
for
well.
sticking with
us. And yeah, we'll see you for the next lesson. Bye.